Well, Mark, welcome to Voice for Values. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Martyn. Privilege.
No trouble at all. Look, Mark, we're here today at the Australian Christian Lobby's West Australian State Conference, and you spoke just before this video was taken, and I spoke, and it was interesting because we both ended up speaking on something very similar. We talked about being salt and particularly being light in the darkness. Perhaps you could drill down for Christians, for the delegates that are here at the conference. What do we mean, or what do you mean, when you talk about the need for Christians, as Jesus said, to be lights in the darkness?
Yeah, and I think sometimes we think salt and light was Jesus using two metaphors to make the one point. Like the generic reference to influence, and if you don't like the salt thing, well, I'll give you another one, the light thing. I actually think there's a profound difference, but they're absolutely related. When Jesus said you're the salt of the earth, the word earth is the word soil, which is salt of the soil, which is not a planetary thing. He's actually talking about the vulnerability of every believer, that we've got to guard what we allow in, because salt of the soil, the challenge is overexposure to the wrong elements, the salt of the soil loses its saltiness. So he was actually warning us, not just inspiring us, because what follows next makes sense. If the salt loses its saltiness, that's a clue. He was talking about salt in the context of our vulnerability, meaning if we, just like the salt of the soil, if overexposed to harsh elements, it can lose the saltiness.
So if we let in the influence of the world, because he's talking about being persecuted for righteousness' sake, he's saying don't compromise, don't let in the bad influence.
He says here's what he's saying, he's got to be aware of your vulnerability. If you think I'm undefeatable and I can go anywhere and do anything and expose myself to anything. Yet he's not telling us to hide in the church. He's not telling us to hide in the corner, because the next statement is, you're the light of the world. And the world is cosmos, which is the aggregate of all humanity, including those hostile to the cause of Christ. So in that, you get a real picture of what I think that passage is about, which is, hey, believer, if you're conscious that you're vulnerable and what you expose your inner self to, the reason I need you to take care of that is because I want you to be the light of the world. And I think that in that is a beautiful picture of the tension that exists, because there's probably a careless stream of faith that doesn't care and calls everything grace and we can do anything and everything, and it allows it all in. And the problem is if you're not salty, you've got nothing to shine.
Right.
See, a lampstand without a light is a stick. So really the position means nothing unless you've got a distinctive, you've got something different about you. And I think that there's so much we can unpack on that, but I think the idea that if we're conscious of our vulnerability and choose to preserve it, God will position us.
And that really starts then with a character question, doesn't it? Because if you preserve yourself, it starts with actually something that's inward, which I guess is the Beatitudes in a sense that immediately precede it.
Absolutely.
But it starts with something that is inward. It's a Christian character. Be aware of your vulnerability to losing that character and preserve the character.
I think there's two camps in the Christian world, and it's sad that it either has to exist, but it is true. If you don't have the character to preserve the godliness in you, the light doesn't shine. There is nothing to shine. Ask Samson if dancing with Delilah makes no difference to your destiny, or ask Solomon if multiple wives and multiple fades don't affect your wisdom. I think all of us have that potential to allow the wrong things in, and yet we're not meant to land on that verse in complete solitude, because he wants us to be the light of the world. And I think when you recognize that, you come out of hiding, but at the same time, if you the light of the world without being cautious of your character, it's just a higher platform to fail. They've got nothing to shine.
Because that's the danger as well, is if you go straight to the light and you say, well, let's go out there and do great things for Christ. Let's go out there and do great things on the basis of our faith. Yeah. But if you're going to be going out there and doing things, I often say to people, if you're going to go out there, particularly in public life, and try and change things and create change and do good, you're almost saying, well, I'm going to change the world into my image. I'm going to bring myself into that position and make change. But that's jumping the gun, because your image might be rubbish.
Absolutely.
You need to work on that first.
Well, it's the Christ in us.
That's exactly
it's the
right.
Christ in us that's the distinction. Because we're divine treasure in earthen vessels. So no one's highlighting the vessel, but God was saying, don't lose the saltiness. I look at it in a positive way. If I can lose saltiness, I reckon I can get it back too. So I think every believer has a role to play, and no matter how disqualified they may feel, God can redeem, God can restore, because ultimately he wants every believer to be the light of the world.
Yeah, right. I love that, to say that it is actually Christ in us, which is the light of the world. And that's a great perspective to have. whenever we go out there and try and do things that manifest that light.
Absolutely.
And on that, there's many ways we do that. There's good character, there's obviously the context which we find ourselves in day to day, university, school, work, etc., friends, so on. So many places where we can shine the light of Christ and where we can not compromise godly character. Of interest, obviously, to ACL is actually the political sphere. And we're always saying that one of the things Christians can do, and indeed often should do, is become active civically, to become active in terms of speaking up for what they believe politically, in terms of potentially some Christians ending up in the sphere of government, but others supporting those in the sphere of government. Is that a legitimate manifestation of our mandate to be light in the world, to go into the political world and to engage with it?
Absolutely. In fact, I think every believer, depending on the grace or the occupation or the profession, every believer is called to be, we're not called to be the light of the church, we're called to be the light of the world.
Right.
He called us the light of the world. And I think sometimes being the light of the church, as impressive and as comforting as that is, that's not where it starts. That's not where it ends, that's where it starts. And really, we're called to be the light of the world. So to those who have the ability, the persuasion, and the grace, we would support that, cheer that, and in fact encourage that at every possibility, because that's exactly where we're supposed to be.
Yeah, right. That's great. I love that. Light of the church and light of the world at large. And of course, that entails civic engagement.
Absolutely.
Some people struggle with the fact that when Christians can start doing that, sometimes there's blowback. Not everyone's happy about it. You may go out there and there might be a great lot of people that say, well done, good on you. But then there's a large base of people that might want to be hostile or might want to criticize. And some people struggle with the idea that when the church isn't seen as winsome in the eyes of some, is that really what we're called to do? And so how do we deal with that then? That there's going to be an inevitable negativity that can blow back on us when we are lights in public in the world. How should we think about that?
I think if the motivation is the fear of God rather than the fear of man, if we're centered around pleasing God, it does not necessarily translate to pleasing every human being. And, it's like having your own children. I've got 2 boys. I love them wholeheartedly, completely. And yet my love for them necessitates that I do what's right for their benefit. And even though they might not like me, they might not like everything I say, everything I do, I'm not suggesting that in public service we need to be patronizing or aggressive or volatile. But to recoil because we're not liked means the motive to even do it in the first place is wrong. We're not out there to win a popularity contest. We're out there to make a difference. And sometimes even to serve people well is going to draw reaction, spectrum of emotions and a spectrum of responses. And I think that's just a line that we got to cross. And at some point, if that line isn't crossed, it becomes a little confusing. And you're sort of godly enough to want to make a difference, but you don't feel confident enough to go there, but you're not careless enough to totally retract. And I think this lukewarm, half-hearted, I'm half in, half out, is a very frustrating thing for a Christian. Yeah, sure. So I think, we're all in or we're all out. I think middle ground in Australia is disappearing. Right. You could be a grey, sort of neutral believer, and now to not wholeheartedly embrace Christ is to outrightly reject him. I don't mean that as a polarizing statement as if we're trying to create enemies. It's just the reality of the day we're in. Yeah. And, I'd encourage our church, I'd encourage every believer. You're a Christian, you're a Christ believer, you're a Christ follower, and whatever that looks like, that's got to govern the decisions, regardless of the reactions.
Yep. And to go back to the passage we're talking about in Matthew 5, Jesus is almost comprehending this very situation, isn't he? Because he raises the salt of the earth, the light of the world, in the context of, some people are going to revile you and say evil against you falsely on my account. They're going to even persecute you in some contexts, and we know from history and we know from the way things are going in other countries that that's very real. So he is thinking about the fact that not everyone's always going to be happy. And I love what you said, fear God, not men.
Absolutely.
So how can people be helped to be bold then? What would you give advice to Christians who are looking at this and they're seeing, they may even have something happen to them. We have people ring us often and something's happened to them. They're being boycotted in their business, or they've had some challenge against them because they've spoken up for their faith. Or, a young fellow we saw a video of this morning who was suspended from his university because he prayed for a friend. Here's a person saying, well, most of these people get into a bit of a crisis saying, well, have I done the wrong thing? And others out there looking on say, is that where we want to end up? How would you encourage people to have the boldness that they need?
Look, I mean, I think beyond the prayer for boldness, which is an obvious starting place, I think there's something really powerful about doing things together. I think that's why when believers get together, like what Christian Lobby encourages, as well as just the forums where two or three, Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. There's all sorts of spiritual reasons as to why. Sometimes it's just confidence when we're doing this together. I've got a theory that the 3 guys in the fire, it's only a theory, it's not scripture. But I think there's something powerful about 3 guys in the fire, not 1 guy in the fire. Maybe, who knows? There's conjecture, but if you use your imagination for a second, what if not one of the 3 were giants of faith in their own right, but together? Yeah. There was a confidence that triggered each other. Maybe in the pre-service prayer meeting, Shadrach's like, listen, we're not going to bow, all right, stay strong. And they're like, yeah, we're in. And then when you face realities like we're facing in our country, and they're like, bow or else, and one of them maybe just timidly goes, we're not bowing, and looks across nervously, right? Yeah, that's right. Who knows? I mean, I'm being facetious, but you never know the power of together. My theory is, what if 3 people got out of the boat instead of just Peter? Maybe there would have been a different story. I think there's something about doing things together and encouraging each other that really can also have a boldness multiplying impact, especially in the face of the opposition we're facing.
So would you encourage Christians then to support other Christians in the fire, so to speak?
I think that's so important. And it's not because we agree with every aspect of their entire life. We don't have to know everything about them, have their political persuasions, or even agree with every decision they make. But there's something about, if I know I'm supporting you and you're supporting me, it awakens boldness in me. Yes. And I think that's one of the things we need to tap into a lot more as a community of faith.
And one of the difficulties we so often have is that because someone will say something and it's not exactly the way that you would have said it, in exactly the same terms and exactly the same nuance, and because of that, oh no, we can't support them. But it's so sad, isn't it? Because there's always going to be imperfection, because that's who we are as people. And if only there was a swell to say, no, we do support the principles that this person is articulating, and there was that steadfastness of the Christian community. I see this all the time. I mean, I'm just so into what you're saying, in the sense that if we did that, there would be so much more community strength.
I just think Australia's always loved the underdog. We're fast becoming the underdog, and I don't mean that in some sort of defeatist way. I just think that if we would support one another without having to agree on every single detail around it, it would have a compounding impact that I think will awaken faith in even the timid and even the shy. And I think together then we can actually make a light. We can actually stand up strong.
So we can be bold, but we can also be a contagion for boldness to others.
Absolutely, and I think there's a togetherness about light that when you bring all the candles together, it genuinely has a much more multiplying impact. Yep. And God doesn't need much, 2 or 3. But I tell you what, I think we need it. I think we need 2 or 3 sometimes. We need one another, and I love the ability to hear, your heart, your passion for ACL and the direction that this is going, and my role as a pastor and your role as a leader of a movement. I think it's incredible what could happen if people actually stood together, supported one another. Yes. And I just think we've got way more in common than we have apart, and it's time.
Well, you mentioned there that you're in a role as a pastor, Kingdom City. It's a very big movement, and you've got some experience in planting churches, in building churches, in growing that movement. Do you have any thoughts in this regard directly to people who are in the same situation, people who are pastors or in church ministry? How can they get more interested, or how can they help their people to be empowered to do this?
I've just encouraged our church, and again, each pastor has to do what they feel is right, but I've always encouraged our church that they are the workers of ministry. They are the salt and light. It's not me. I'm not bringing light to their world. We are bringing light to our world. Right. And so really, if everybody and every pastor started with the premise of, I'm really here to awaken the Christ in each person, and really let that trigger and fall into all the streams that they touch, including politics, entertainment, sport, media, education, whatever. Yes. I think if every pastor would be more conscious of that as a starting point, we will see more light lit up, rather than just trying to be the source of light ourselves. Yeah, right. So awaken it in others.
And for a lot of churches out there who are involved in preaching the gospel and raw evangelism, which is so important, it's about taking those people then and discipling them on into all of those different channels.
Yeah, and look, I mean, our catchphrase, we talk about bringing the reality of God to our world. Right. Again, not bring the reality of God to our church, but if whatever your world contains, if you're just married, that's your marriage. If it's missional and it's national or it's whatever, for just someone in depression, your world is barely outside your own head. But either way, whatever your world is, our job as salt and light is to bring the reality of God to our world. And so I think more than just the programs and the events, which we all do, and I think they're great, it's not to center around an institution or an organization, it's to awaken the organism that is the body of Christ. And I think if every member finds its function, we will see miracles, we will see light, we will see impact in the right spirit, in the right manner, but just the sheer flood of light will displace darkness without much difficulty.
Mark, so good to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time. Cheers.
It's an honor, man. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. If you're not salty, you've got nothing to shine.
Right.
See, a light, a lampstand without a light is a stick. So really the position means nothing unless you've got a distinctive, you've got something different about you. And I think there's so much we can unpack on that. But I think the idea that if we're conscious of our vulnerability and choose to preserve it, God will position us.